I'm Mark Espinmol, part of the División de Estudios Internacionales in CIDE in Mexico City, and I'm joined by three of my colleagues, Jorge Esquiavon, also from Estudios Internacionales, Carlos Bravo, director of the program of Periodismo of Journalism here at CIDE, and my colleague Carlos Heredia, also from Estudios Internacionales. The purpose here in this little segment is to talk about the first 100 days of the Trump administration, of President Trump, and particularly how he has affected Mexico and relations between the two countries. So I'm going to start off with that question to my three colleagues. What's the impact been on Mexico? Carlos.
Thanks, Mark. I think the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship is at its worst crisis in decades. Why is that? Because the Trump government has failed to understand the depth of our interdependence in the economy, in trade, in a combined labor force, and in cooperation for security. So I understand what was driving Mr. Trump during his campaign to lure voters who would identify a common enemy or a common scapegoat. But now that he's in the White House and it's going to be 100 days of his administration, I think his rhetoric has driven the bilateral relationship into a very severe crisis. How is that crisis defined? Basically by the fact that rather than working from our interdependence and our shared resources, he is trying to put Mexicans against the United States and Americans against Mexico, and that is going to damage not only the diplomatic cooperation that we have, but the everyday lives of citizens in our two countries.
I would say that the main impact of Donald Trump in Mexico has been, on the one hand, provoking a sort of upsurge of nationalist feeling in Mexico. Donald Trump has made alive again a certain vocabulary regarding the U.S. and Mexico that had been for a long time not used on a daily basis. There have been a lot of articles in newspapers, comments in TV, in social media about the Yankees, about the U.S.-Mexico war, a lot of things that show us that especially since the 1990 onwards, we had developed a new vocabulary. We talked about the U.S. and Mexico in terms of partners, in terms of friends, in terms of neighbors, even in terms of family. So the first thing that Donald Trump has done is turn back the clock in terms of the image of the U.S. and Mexico. And the second thing has been that because of that, he has put the Mexican government in an incredibly tough spot. Because on the one hand, the Mexican government has had to deal with this upsurge of nationalist feeling, of anti-American feeling in Mexico, but on the other hand, the Mexican government has to deal with Donald Trump. And I think President Peña Nieto has tried very hard to behave like the adult in the room, but it's very hard to be an adult in the room with a kid who's very bad, who behaves very badly, and a kid that you can't actually discipline.
I couldn't agree more with my colleagues. I think we are in a new era in the U.S.-Mexico relations. We passed from being distant neighbors to being partners to being something like a family that fights amongst itself with the anti-Mexican comments of Trump and the generation of a new Mexican nationalism against the United States and especially against President Trump. Let me just give you an example. We have this survey here at CIDE that we conduct every 2 years in terms of public opinion and foreign affairs. The president of the US and the international leader with the worst evaluation in the history of the survey in the last 15 years is Donald Trump. And also, we had seen in the course of the last decade that the level of trust of Mexicans vis-a-vis the US changed from levels of 30% to 40% to 50%, then 60% of Mexicans trusted the US. Today, this is the other way around. It went to 70% of mistrust of the US. So we are in a completely different era in terms of the US-Mexico relations.
And you think about the way that the rhetoric matters for this relationship. Donald Trump has taken a complicated relationship, as you've said, better and better over the years, much more like partners, much more like family. And whatever niggling small things that have emerged as problems, has taken those things and constructed them in a process of trying to generate fear and misunderstanding and hatred among Americans toward Mexico in a very counterproductive way. This is the way it seems to me. I wanted to follow up on what you said a little bit. Does this present an opportunity for Mexico? Partly by the sense of national unity and building upon that, and the other is for Mexico to continue the process of diversifying relations away from the United States and a little bit into other parts of the world, and maybe in other ways. Do you sense this as an opportunity?
Japanese say that crisis is opportunity, and therefore I do think that this is a great opportunity for Mexico, not only in terms of the diversification of its international affairs, but actually in terms of investing in foreign policy and rebuilding an infrastructure in terms of foreign policy for Mexico to be better, to have better resources and instruments to be able to negotiate with the American administration. So yes, I do think that something that hasn't been a priority in terms of policies in Mexico, which has been foreign policy, today it is clear for all Mexicans, the public, the leaders, even the Mexican president, that foreign policy is important and therefore we should invest more in it.
Let me jump into the national unity issue. I think in regular circumstances, it would have been a no-brainer for national unity. Because, you know, Donald Trump very easily became like a foreign threat. His anti-Mexican sentiment, his anti-immigrant rhetoric could have been really easily used, for what political scientists call a process of rallying around the flag. But it wasn't, and it couldn't be, because of the weakness of the Mexican president. The Mexican president is weak in a number of ways in regards to this particular issue. On the one hand, his popularity is incredibly low. It's in the single digits. On second place, he has exhausted his political capital. He's, for all practical matters, a lame duck. You know, the presidential election is right around the corner. And the third one is he has been tarnished by a lot of scandals in terms of human rights, in terms of corruption, in terms of impunity. So the natural figure around which people could unite in this process of national unity that you were mentioning cannot be him. And if it can't be the president, the opposition is very disorganized, very fragmented. So there hasn't been a leadership around which to coalesce.
Let me address a key issue for U.S. citizens, security. I mean, there are two underlying mistakes in Donald Trump's Mexico policy: the wall and the war on drugs. Why are these mistakes prevailing so far? Because the idea of Mexico that he has built reinforces Mexicans as a threat. Not Mexicans as partners, and not Mexicans as allies. So the wall has been postponed because he did not get funding from the US Congress for this fiscal year. But it's, in any event, it is a monumental waste of US taxpayers' money. And the other big mistake is believing that unrest and violence in Mexico is produced just by Mexicans themselves and not by misguided policies. I mean, the fact that the belief that potential security threats in Mexico can be solved by military-led efforts, interdiction of drugs, and massive arrests is a big mistake. These have resulted in serious setbacks for human rights, the rule of law, and public security. And the way to address these issues is by making sure that we build a functioning police and judiciary that can investigate criminal networks, root out corruption, and combat impunity.
Thanks very much. Now, we're gonna see inevitably a renegotiation of NAFTA, or an opening up of NAFTA at least. Now, I'm wondering, and the sentiment from Trump has been protectionist, clearly, nationalist, protectionist, American jobs, old mercantilist thing that you would have thought died out 200 years ago when David Ricardo published his theory of comparative advantage, but it's never died out. This idea that we have to close borders in order to help American jobs. But it's going to be opened up. Now, NAFTA was created 23 years ago by a coalition of like-minded interests across 3 countries. Where is that coalition now? Will they emerge again, or are they still there? Can they save the gains from NAFTA while improving it in other respects?
I think the lesson that can be derived from the conversations and the negotiations of NAFTA 24 years ago is that you cannot basically impose a trade agreement from the top down. You have to create a constituency. And it is not enough getting the votes for passage through Congress in Washington and through Congress in Mexico City or Parliament in Ottawa. Creating a constituency means that trade agreements have to work for the average citizen. And working for the average citizen means the uplift of the standard of living for the US, Canadian, and Mexican workers. There's a widening gap between the rate of growth of productivity in the 3 countries and total workers' compensation. So if you see a trend towards greater inequality that is reinforced by a trade agreement that only caters to the interests of a few, then you're going in the wrong direction. We need to see greater trade investment flows amongst our 3 countries that are based on the premise, on the underlying assumption that only policies that reach all citizens can function in an economy that works for everybody.
And you mentioned before the glaring failure to include trade unions.
Exactly.
Mexican trade unions.
And that is exactly the problem. When NAFTA was negotiated, it was thought exclusively as a free trade agreement for the free flow of goods, services, and capitals. Therefore, during the negotiation, the other sectors of the economy, especially also migration, were not included. Therefore, since its inception in 1994, NAFTA was only and exclusively a way to better trade. And therefore, it hasn't generated, not in Canada, not in the US, and not in Mexico, a social basis of support, a constituency for it to actually have supporters. Therefore, we are here after more than 20 years of NAFTA with President Trump saying he wants to renegotiate, and there is no one, not in Canada, not in the US, and not in Mexico, except, once again, for those who negotiated it originally, which are big enterprises and the government who support NAFTA. Therefore, we are in a very weak situation in terms of our capabilities of renegotiation.
I think there's also this, strange position that NAFTA occupies in the bilateral relationship. Because on the one hand, NAFTA is more than 20 years old. A lot has happened since then. In other circumstances, it would make a lot of sense to revisit it and try to update it. There are whole segments of the economy that are not even contemplated in NAFTA. For instance, all the virtual economy. So on the one hand, it would make sense, to try to, renew NAFTA, to put it up to date. But on the other hand, in the situation of uncertainty and the threat that Trump has created, of course nobody, in Mexico at least, nobody wants to touch NAFTA because in a normal situation we could negotiate, we could make it better, but the threat of making it worse or actually canceling it is felt so deeply that better don't touch it, leave it alone. Of course, the other thing I think it's important is to realize that it is unfair to portray NAFTA as a treaty that has produced national winners and losers. The winners and losers of NAFTA are distributed within each country. There are certain sectors and certain regions of Mexico that have benefited immensely from NAFTA, and there are also people, particularly on the countryside, that have lost a lot. The same happens in the US, and the same happens in NAFTA. Now, the integration that these three countries have achieved so far would actually lead us to believe that in order to make an evaluation of NAFTA, we need to stop thinking in national terms, because the results of NAFTA are a mixed bag for everyone.
Sure. Okay. And as you mentioned, one final question. We'll have elections here in about a little over a year. Is AMLO the person to lead Mexico in this almost existential struggle against the United States, if you characterize it? Is AMLO the right candidate?
Well, it is up to Mexican voters to say that. But what I can tell you is that our current leaders, President Peña Nieto and his cabinet, have failed to take the pulse of Mexican citizens as a whole, because we do not want a government that is subservient to the United States, that just follows suit, the dictum of Washington, but we rather would want a government that addresses Americans as a nation, as a country, that goes beyond Washington and talks to people in all states, especially in the border states, that talks to academia, that talks to the workers, that talks to the churches, that engages in public diplomacy and explains not only how important Mexico is for the United States, but how important each country is for the destiny of the other country. Let me just wrap up with one example. If I talk to the US audience, I have to tell you that the food that is put on your table every day is a result of the hard work of Mexican agricultural workers who pick up the crops that end at the family table.
I don't know if AMLO is the right guy or not, to be frank, but I would say this. I think that there are three characteristics that anybody who becomes president in 2018 should have in order to be able to deal with the Trump situation, so to speak. On the one hand, I think it needs to be a president that is aware of the domestic demand in Mexico for a foreign policy towards Trump. I think Peña Nieto's administration has failed to take into account that domestic constituency. I think the next president needs to be very aware of what Mexicans feel and what Mexicans demand regarding Trump. On the second characteristic, I think he has to be a president who's also very aware of the importance of the bilateral relationship and aware of the fact that this relationship will survive Trump. That you need to play a long game, even though you're dealing with the news cycle with very intense and immediate responses. You need to have your mind set on the long game. And the third one, I think, is it needs to be a president aware of the fact that whatever the Mexican response is to Donald Trump's administration, it has larger reverberations. Mexico is called, whether it wants it or not, to perform an international leadership role in terms of what the international community can and can't do regarding Trump. So those three characteristics, I think, I would look for them among the candidates to see who fits that bill better.
And exactly following this, I think that the Mexican electorate, the Mexican public, is tired of traditional Mexican politicians. And therefore, the idea of someone who presents himself as anti-system, as AMLO has done in the course of his last two attempts to achieve the presidency in Mexico, has given him some kind of popular idea that he could be the one that could represent the ideas of the true public instead of the traditional politicians. And also, I would say that Trump's comments against Mexico, and especially the not so good response of the Mexican government, gave AMLO some extra points. But however, we still have more than 1 year to go to the 2018 election. Probably he won some points after the Trump election, but many things can happen. I do think that whoever will be the Mexican president in 2019 has to present himself as something different of the traditional Mexican political system and the traditional Mexican political parties. Whether it's AMLO or someone else, I don't know.
Great, thank you very much to my colleagues. We're going to wrap it up there, and thank you all for joining us on